Let's add just a tiny bit about wildfires. Wildfires get a lot of attention. Of course, there are many examples of arson or unintentional setting of fires as well. So when you have intrinsically dry regions like parts of California, and either there are lightnings on top of multiple years of droughts, or people doing barbecue or intentionally setting fires, they make huge news, especially like the Australian fire of 2018, I think, killed like 1 billion animals. So obviously they are high impact events, but actually there is no clear evidence that wildfires have increased in number. Okay, so in fact they have decreased because of human control. Fires are mostly controlled by climatic factors. So the human impact is kind of indirect. So if you change precipitation, increase temperature, you can make the vegetation more susceptible to wildfires. So it's an indirect effect. So burned fraction of land here showing global distribution of fire regimes in terms of low, medium, and high intensity. The two remotely sensed variables combined here are the burned area data from the Global Fire Emissions Database and fire radiative power data, otherwise known as fire intensity, from a satellite called MODIS, Moderate Resolution something, categorized into three intensity classes. Okay. After having a high annual burned areas, areas having high annual burned areas are those subject to frequent fires, whereas intensity is higher in fires consuming large amounts of fuel. Okay. I should know MODIS. Let's see what is MODIS. MODIS is moderate resolution something sensor. What? How did I forget that? I actually worked on MODIS data for some time. Moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer. There we go. It's just like CWIPs, which we looked at in terms of the animation of the ocean and land biosphere. CWIPs is Sea Viewing Wide Field of Sensor satellite, whereas MODIS is Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer. Okay, good. So you can see the regions where there are low intensity fires and high intensity fires and medium intensity fires. So the question, of course, is how do they affect carbon cycle? And also they are always brought up in the discussion about planting 1 trillion trees is an idea for mitigating climate. People tend to think of it as a silver bullet. So if wildfires can just put out all that carbon back into the atmosphere, then is it really a sink? How long will it keep it? And there are questions about whether mature forests will continue to sequester carbon. Some data says yes, and so on and so forth. But wildfires are a big part of terrestrial ecosystems and global carbon cycle. We have looked at this already in different ways, but just to repeat ourselves, we are looking at fluxes which are very large with small differences which have to be figured out in terms of the sequestration of carbon or emission of carbon. This is older. You can always look at the amount in the atmosphere and say how old it is. We are now at 800, I think. There are all these other sources and sinks we talked about. The fossil fuel sitting there, Earth's crust, ocean holding lots of carbon. In the context of terrestrial ecosystems, the idea of looking at this again is to say that gross primary productivity is dominated by photosynthetically available radiation. Light is a severe limitation, but respiration, which is the emission of carbon, is dominated by temperature. So there is plenty of evidence that increasing temperatures drive more respiration and loss of carbon, especially from the soil, because warm soils also drive more microbes and loss of carbon and so on. This is nice work, I think, from Haberi et al. In 2007. Why I think it is from them. This is the human use of terrestrial ecosystems. What fraction of primary production is being used by human beings for various purposes like food and feed for animals and timber and construction and fireplaces in the house and so on and so forth. This also relates to about the number of earths we are using up. Now, in terms of carrying capacity, we are at 1.25 or so. So we are going to soon run out of the planet and maybe colonize other planets or grow potatoes on the moon and Mars and who knows, right? So you can see that places like India, huge proportion of the terrestrial ecosystem is used up by human beings, as well as China, Europe, parts of the US, and so on. What does it mean? Obviously, we have to basically try to manage those as well when we talk about enhancing natural sinks of carbon in soils and vegetation. We have to touch a little bit about abiotic factors in climate change like temperature, carbon dioxide, precipitation, and UV radiation and the impacts. So aquatically speaking, there is salinity stress, hypoxia, which is a loss of oxygen and suffocating marine ecosystems, acidification, which is the reduction in the pH value of ocean waters, which is not good for corals and other calcifying animals. Calcification itself is suffering because of that. Coral bleaching is because of warming and the acidification. Water mixing and circulation, so the dynamic response of the ocean to warming in terms of stratification changes. Fisheries yield, obviously human pressure on fisheries and disease pressure because of warming oceans. Heat waves in the ocean, acidification, and loss of corals as well affects fisheries. And sea ice. Arctic is now a poster child for loss of sea ice and rapid warming with the polar amplification. Okay, so there are migration, thermal stress, photodegradation, UV sunscreens, photosynthesis, and so on. On land, we have drought stress, stomatal function, phenology, so the seasonality of the plants' cycles during the year, crop yields because of temperature, precipitation changes, but also pollution like ozone, food quality. So there is evidence that with warming, maybe lesser micronutrients are taken up by some crops. Has to be studied more. Fires, soil erosion, human activities, glacier loss, and air quality effects, all of them resulting in flooding, runoff, eutrophication, which is excess nutrients into coastal waters or lakes and rivers which drive large blooms, and those blooms are not consumed by zooplankton because they are too fast and too large. Then they sink and are consumed by microbes which use up the oxygen and create anoxia and hypoxia, which kill other fish and so on. Okay, stream flows, dissolved organic matter, sea level rise, carbon, and water cycles. The last thing we want to look at, last few things we want to look at are precipitation trends. Okay, if we compare temperature trends which had large patterns with polar amplification, less warming in the tropics and so on, you see many more signals here in the tropics and very, very patchy signals. This is what we mean when we say precipitation has much smaller decorrelation scale. If you correlate precipitation at one point with the surrounding points, it has a very small correlation going very far, whereas temperature will have much larger correlation because precipitation is mostly like popcorns. Even though we see the ITCZ, it happens only when we average over time. Okay, so this is in millimeter per day for 1950 to 2008, and these reddish yellowish colors are all drying, and the bluish colors are where some wetting or increased precipitation is happening. Southeastern US is unusual even in terms of warming, which we may see later on, and so forth. Monsoon trends over Asia are of concern, especially because they are also occurring as very wet events, very heavy extreme rainfall events. This is showing changes in percent of global precipitation falling on wettest days. Okay, so already the top 5% of the wettest days are taken. On average, there is already 22.5% of the heavy rain falling on wet days. This is on top of that. And the main message here is that there was an up and down before, but since about the mid-1980s, the number of heavy rain events on wettest days, or global precipitation falling on wettest days, is increasing. Okay, and these are for individual years. You can see some years have mega wet events. So regionally, when you look at the rainfall changes, you can have reducing rainfall here, for example, and yet have extreme rainfalls. So it's the duration, intensity, and number of rainy days that matter. So if you have a season of June to September, total rainfall may be reduced, number of rainy days may be reduced, but during the rainy days there is very heavy rainfall causing floods, which means there are other regions which are getting very strong droughts at the same time. Okay, so this is the problem with precipitation. I will do these tipping points in the next podcast to close out this rather long chapter. It's a marathon chapter, but basically introduced all the topics, and we will end it with what we mean by tipping points in the system, which we have to be careful for, but they are not always incredibly well defined. We will see that.